Right, so since Wednesday, particularly amongst the Tories, we've seen a significant ramping up of Islamophobic sentiment and accusations, and it's all designed to basically silence us all on the matter of Gaza. What we are seeing is a concerted effort, not just by the Tories incidentally, Labour as well, to have any show of support or solidarity for Palestine to be conflated with supporting Hamas. Completely racist to do as that is, but it's designed to shut us up again, weaponizing racism once more, and they're doing it because it worked before. How many people still think the lifelong anti-racist Jeremy Corbyn is a raging antisemite still, after all? Muslims across this country, as well as anyone else supporting Gaza in the face of genocide, are being made out to be terrorist sympathisers in effect, with the threat of the law being potentially brought to bear on us over it. It's cultural genocide being committed by the West, being committed by establishment figures, not just in the UK, but abroad as well. Yet these are the people who will call us criminals if we let them get away with it. Right, so the weaponization of Islamophobia is what we're witnessing right now, yet again. Muslim people the country over will of course be extremely concerned about what they are hearing from our politicians by way of attacks on people, basically just for supporting Gaza. But of course those communities are the ones being pointed out. And one of the most prominent examples has been Deputy Chairman, or former Deputy Chairman of the Tory party, Lee Anderson. 30p Lee, the Leanderthal, living up to that moniker this time for sure, dragging his knuckles to the GB News studio for his second job of spreading vile hard-right nonsense to anyone daft enough to watch him. That said, I'm now going to ask you to watch a bit of him now, but all in the name of science, you understand.
I heard the comments earlier you was making about Suella, some of the comments she made earlier this week, and I don't actually believe that these Islamists have got control of our country, but what I do believe is they've got control of Khan and they've got control of London. And again, this stems with Khan. He's actually given our capital city away to his mates. We've got to beware, because if you let Labour in through the back door, expect more of this and expect our cities to be taken over by these lunatics.
Right, so he doesn't believe that Islamists, well, we tend to call them Muslims actually, Lee, but I suppose calling them Islamists makes them sound a little bit more dangerous, a bit more militant rather than observers of just a certain religion. But he doesn't believe they've taken over the country, at least, but they have taken over London, which is just as bad and just as mad, because apparently they control London Mayor Sadiq Khan. Muslims controlling Muslims in power. Muslims pulling the strings behind the scenes, that they're the real ones in charge, in the shadows. He's given the capital away to his mates, according to Lee. So are the, well, let's call them the Muslim lobby, I suppose. Let's regard this mythical entity of Anderson's fevered mind in charge of Khan, or are they his mates then? Make your mind up. Beware Labour, these people are lunatics. Labour will let them take over. So finishing on an attack on his old party, Labour. Anderson used to work in the office of former Labour MP Gloria De Piero, in case you weren't aware. But this is, of course, blatant dog whistle Islamophobia and fearmongering, weaponising Muslims as some sort of boogeymen against everyone else. And that will terrify people who live in those communities. People in them will be endangered by that sort of rhetoric, because we've seen it all happen before. We've seen attacks on them as a result of it. I'd also use the classic example of exposing the racism, because imagine the reaction if instead of Muslims, Anderson was talking about Jews here instead. He'd be accused of anti-Semitism before his feet touched the floor, and would almost certainly have been suspended from the Tory party by now for making such blatantly racist comments as those would be. But instead, Islamophobia is once again on show as less important, because Sunak hasn't budged an inch on such things. Anderson's comments came in light of a Tory Graph article he referenced, the Daily Telegraph, most loyal of those Tory papers, and notably and uncustomarily not hidden behind a paywall either. So a story, a narrative that paper's proprietors would clearly like spread as far as possible on this occasion. And it was entitled, Suella Braverman, Islamists are in charge of Britain now. And she claims this is happening because of what happened at the SNP Gaza ceasefire motion on the opposition day just on last Wednesday. Here's an excerpt from that which is relevant. Mrs. Braverman, who was sacked by Mr. Sunak after she accused police of playing favourites with pro-Palestinian protesters, accused Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, of being in hock to extremists and taking the Speaker hostage with a grubby backroom deal over the Labour amendment. The truth is that the Islamists, the extremists and the anti-Semites are in charge now, she wrote. They have bullied the Labour Party. They have bullied our institutions, and now they have bullied our country into submission. The former Home Secretary accused political leaders of burying their heads in the sand, preferring to believe in the illusion of a successful multicultural society, and remaining terrified of being called racist if they challenged them. But the law has not changed. Mass extremism parades itself proudly. Campuses remain dangerous places for Jews, and Labour is still rotten to the core, she said. As utterly unhinged as ever she was, a multicultural country she's very much part of and she's very much benefited from. But clearly the Tories can see advantage in making out that Labour are being controlled by extreme Islamist factions of some description. They put down an amendment to the SNP's ceasefire motion, but it was as much about neutering it for the Israel lobby as Labour's was. Labour just couldn't be seen to yet again be agreeing with the Tories on something like this. Now, if you watched my video from yesterday, which covered now deleted footage aired by Sky News, why did you delete that, Sky News? Where Starmer revealed he had come to his ceasefire amendment after having spoken to the President of Israel, Isaac Herzog. It's a pretty hard reach to think Starmer is beholden to Muslim influence when it's been pretty obvious, and this kind of dotted the I's and crossed the T's on it, that Starmer owes everything to the Israel lobby, and it very much now looks like he could be taking direct instruction from them. So why do the Tories not point that out? Well, that would blow the anti-Semitism scam they helped perpetrate right out of the water. They can't criticise Israeli influence because they conflated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And if they roll back on that now, all that business concerning a certain former Labour leader, one Jeremy Corbyn, would be far more widely exposed. Not least his attempts at negotiating with Hamas, for instance, those references to being his friends, which should be seen in a different and far more honest light these days, as they should be. Instead, the Tories are now seeking advantage by accusing Starmer and co of leaning on the Speaker, which he probably did, but as part of some Muslim plot. And it's Hoyle himself who opened the door to that, with his excuses after the fallout on Wednesday, claiming some terrorist element was coming for MPs, and that's why he allowed Labour's amendment. Before the debate, he said he was suspending Standing Order 31 without a vote to do so because it was outdated. He weaponised some kind of terrorist plot to save his own backside, is how it looks now. We have no more proof of this plot than his words. And because of that, he's given the Tories an attack on Labour using Islamophobia as a club, which is shameless and depraved, and with Suella Braverman proudly saying it parades itself proudly. And in doing so, she is in no uncertain terms dragging the pro-Gaza ceasefire demonstrations that we see every single weekend, quite rightfully so, into this web of deceit too, accusing anyone taking part in those marches of being part of a baying hate mob trying to take over our country. Instead of just standing up for people on the receiving end of genocide, being blown to bits by a country which actually has far too much influence in our political class, who we're still supplying arms to, and stand accused of aiding and abetting in that genocide. But no, those of us who speak out against, march and protest against that, we're the problem, according to her. She's amongst the most cruel, self-serving, deranged politicians we have today, and shame on the people of Fareham and Waterlooville if she's still an MP after the next election. I could add in Liz Truss at this point. She was standing with the far right in the US this week, you might have seen that, claiming conservatism is endangered in the UK. More's the pity it isn't, but again she stoked anti-Semitism and Islamophobia to do so. Frankly, the less said about Truss the better though. She actually believes she was forced out as part of an agenda rather than the fact she crashed the economy. The tractor Tories of Norfolk that keep electing her have a lot to answer for. She was outlasted by a lettuce guy's "you didn't grow her." There was also Robert Jenrick, Honest Bob, so called because he's anything but who said that Britain has allowed our streets to be dominated by Islamist extremists. In all seriousness, though, this is such a dangerous time for British politics, and it's going to endanger people in Muslim communities up and down the country. The same people that hammered Corbyn over racism are the same people giving Truss and Anderson and Braverman a free pass on the bile they are spilling, and that's why this is so rampantly Islamophobic. It was Hoyle and Starmer that opened the door to this, to stymie an SNP motion calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza because they're in hock to the Israel lobby. MPs today are in no more danger from a Muslim terrorist attack today than they were last Tuesday or last week, because this is weaponisation of Islamophobia to get both Starmer and Speaker off the hook. This is Islamophobia that is completely out of control, not Muslim influence. but being propagated right now by our parliamentarians, media editors such as those of the Telegraph, and their journalists, and other journalists as well who have made disparaging comments from other publications as well. During World War II, we know Jews were ostracised, amongst other demographics of course, and before then too, stick with me, viewed as outsiders lurking within an acceptable establishment midst. And we know how that ended up, we know how that went. Now we're seeing it happen again with Muslims, and all for what? Political capital and to excuse Israeli genocide. If you're going to make these claims, especially in Parliament, claiming you're protecting MPs by bending the rules, let's see the evidence of it. I'm not going to take Hoyle's word for a damn thing, not when he hasn't been able to get his story straight. Peter Oborne, former Conservative voter no less, who writes for Middle East Eye these days, wrote on this matter of evidence. No evidence has been provided. No evidence from the Speaker, who set the media storm in motion. Nothing from Starmer, who briefed him. Remember that physical and verbal intimidation are crimes. That includes common assault and even the use of threatening language, including online. Anyone who physically threatens an MP or any other politician can and must be prosecuted. If such threats have been made, as Starmer and Speaker Hoyle claim, then charges must follow, and then jail sentences. Thus far, such claims are not standing up. He's absolutely right. The excuses of Lindsay Hoyle have set in motion an appalling attack on Muslims and support for Gaza, which could even encourage further legislation to clamp down on these, such as the fact both main opposition and government are completely at odds with the general public on this matter, on the matter of a ceasefire. It's dangerous, and all these politicians should be justifiably condemned. And if you watch this video recommendation here up next, I detail how Hoyle's excuses have come unravelled. Not that this is being pointed out by the mainstream media at all. It shows where all this Islamophobic sentiment is now coming from, what he's done that has triggered this. That should make him even more unfit to remain in post as House of Commons Speaker. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.